The slap landed loud enough to turn heads 3 cars away. It wasn't a dramatic swing. No wind-up. No rage-filled scream. Just a sharp, sudden motion from the officer's open hand, cutting across the man's face as if correcting a disobedient child. Skin met skin. The sound echoed against concrete, glass, and steel. For a half-second, the street froze, traffic idled. A bus hissed. Somewhere nearby, a phone camera kept recording. The man staggered 1 step, not from pain, but from surprise. He did not fall. He did not shout. He did not raise his hands in defense. He simply stood there, blinking once, his jaw tightening as he absorbed what had just happened. A thin red line began to bloom along his cheek. The officer leaned in close, his voice low, confident, practiced. The kind of tone that assumed obedience without question. "You don't get to stare at me like that," the officer said. "You understand?" The man said nothing. That he was a black man in his early 40s, dressed plainly. Dark jacket. Neutral slacks. No visible badge. No uniform. No obvious markers of authority. Just another face the officer believed he could dominate without consequence. Behind them, the red and blue lights continued to pulse, painting the scene in alternating colors. A patrol car blocked half the lane. 2 more officers stood nearby, arms crossed, watching but not intervening. Their silence was approval. A woman across the street raised her phone higher. Someone in a parked sedan rolled down a window. Another phone appeared. Then another. The moment was no longer private. It was documented. The man finally spoke, calmly, evenly. "Are you finished?" he asked. The officer laughed, short and dismissive. He took a step back, hands resting comfortably on his duty belt, body language relaxed. This was routine to him. Control asserted. Respect enforced. "You don't ask questions here," the officer replied. "You do what you're told." The man nodded once, slowly. Not in submission, but in acknowledgement. His eyes moved briefly to the patrol car's dash camera, then to the phones held by strangers, then back to the officer's face. He seemed to be measuring something, weighing time. A faint smear of blood reached the corner of his mouth. He wiped it away with his thumb and looked at it, expression unchanged. "Okay," he said. The officer mistook the word for surrender. What he didn't know was that the camera capturing this moment was not the only one recording. What he didn't know was that the man standing in front of him was trained to let arrogance reveal itself fully before acting. What he didn't know was that this slap would become evidence. The street resumed its breath. Engines hummed. A pedestrian whispered, "Did you see that?" Another shook his head slowly. The officer turned slightly, signaling to his colleagues that the situation was under control. He had no urgency. No concern. No awareness that the power dynamic he believed was fixed had already begun to shift. The man stood still, composed, his posture unbroken. He said nothing more. He did nothing dramatic, but in that silence, something irreversible had started. Because this was not just an act of violence. It was a mistake. The officer's confidence filled the space like exhaust, thick and unquestioned. Years of unchecked authority had taught him that moments like this ended one way. The person on the receiving end learned their place. The system closed ranks. The day moved on. He didn't notice the man's breathing slow. Didn't notice how his shoulders settled, how his gaze steadied. Those were tells, but only to people trained to read them. A delivery truck rolled past, its driver craning his neck. Somewhere, a siren wailed and faded. Life continued, unaware that this intersection had become a fault line. The officer pointed toward the sidewalk. "Stand over there," he ordered. The man took 1 step, then stopped. "I will," he said quietly, "in a moment." The officer frowned, irritation flashing across his face. Disobedience, however mild, was something he did not tolerate. His hand lifted again, not yet striking, but threatening, and every phone on the street stayed locked on them. Watching. The officer's hand hovered in the air, fingers loose, a promise of repetition more than a threat. He didn't strike again. Not yet. Instead, he let the pause stretch, savoring the imbalance. Control, to him, was not just about force. It was about anticipation. You got a problem following directions? He asked. The man met his eyes. Calm. Measured. Unflinching. No, he said. I have a problem being struck. A murmur rippled through the small crowd forming along the curb. Nothing loud. Just the kind of low, uneasy sound people make when they sense a line has been crossed but aren't sure who will be punished for noticing, the officer scoffed. You should have thought about that before running your mouth. I haven't said much, the man replied. That landed wrong. The officer took a step forward, closing the distance again. He was taller, broader, armored by his uniform and the certainty that it represented. His voice rose just enough for the cameras to catch it clearly. You think you're smarter than me, he said. You think you can talk your way out of this? The man didn't answer immediately. His eyes drifted again, briefly, to the bystanders. To the phones. To the red recording icons glowing like tiny warnings. I think you're on camera, he said. The officer's smile vanished. One of the other officers shifted his weight, glancing at the crowd. Another scanned the street, as if suddenly aware of how exposed they were. But no one stepped in. Silence, again, functioned as consent. Turn those damn phones off, the officer barked, looking past the man toward the onlookers. No one did. A woman shook her head. A man in a hoodie said quietly, it's a public street. That was enough. The officer pointed at the man's chest, finger nearly touching fabric. You're being detained now, he said. For obstruction. Obstruction of what? The man asked. Of my patience, the officer snapped. He reached for the man's arm, gripping just above the elbow. It wasn't necessary. It wasn't procedural. It was possessive. The man tensed slightly but did not pull away. I'm going to advise you, he said evenly, to reconsider how you're handling this. The officer laughed again, louder this time. You don't advise me of anything. The grip tightened. A phone zoomed in. Another voice from the crowd spoke up. Hey, he didn't do anything. The officer glanced toward the voice, eyes sharp. You want to be next? The crowd went quiet. That was the escalation. Not the slap. Not even the threat of another. It was the way the authority expanded outward, daring anyone else to challenge it. Testing how far the silence would stretch, the man inhaled slowly. Officer, he said, you should let go of my arm. Or what? The officer replied. The man's gaze dropped briefly to the officer's hand. Then back up or this gets complicated. That word caught the officer's attention. Complicated meant paperwork. It meant supervisors. It meant questions. He hated questions. He shoved the man back a step instead, releasing his arm only to push him off balance. The move was sudden enough to draw gasps. The man recovered quickly, feet planting firmly on the pavement. Now you're resisting, the officer said. I'm standing, the man replied. The officer turned to his colleagues. You seeing this? They nodded. One reached toward his radio but stopped. Another adjusted his vest, eyes flicking again to the phones. There was a calculation happening now. The kind that came too late. The man straightened his jacket. The blood on his cheek had dried, leaving a dark mark against his skin. He didn't wipe it away this time. He let it remain visible. You don't know who I am, he said quietly. The officer smirked. I know exactly who you are. No, the man said. You don't. That certainty unsettled him more than anger would have. The officer took a breath, steadying himself, then gestured toward the patrol car. Hands behind your back, he ordered. The man did not move. The street seemed to lean in. Engines idled louder. Someone whispered, oh no. This is your last chance, the officer said. The man looked at the patrol car. At the dash camera. At the badge number on the officer's chest. He committed it to memory with the ease of someone trained to do so. I'm giving you one, he replied. The officer's face flushed. He reached for his cuffs, and in that moment, the escalation became irreversible. Because what began as an unchecked act of violence was now turning into something larger. Something public. Something that would not stay contained within this block. The phones kept recording. The cameras kept watching, and the officer, still unaware of who he was dealing with, made the decision that would end his career. The cuffs clicked once in the officer's hand, a small metallic sound that carried farther than it should have. He rolled them between his fingers, letting the man see them, letting the cameras see them. It was a familiar ritual. A visual reminder of how this would end. "Turn around," the officer said. The man didn't. Instead, he spoke in the same controlled tone he had used since the slap. "You're escalating without cause." That was enough. The officer grabbed him again, this time with intent. His hand closed around the man's shoulder, fingers digging in as he tried to force him toward the patrol car. The movement was abrupt, aggressive, and unnecessary. It was the kind of contact meant to provoke a reaction. "Stop resisting," the officer shouted. "I'm not resisting," the man replied, his feet sliding but staying under him. "You're grabbing me." The distinction didn't matter. It never did. One of the other officers stepped closer, positioning himself at the man's side. Not to de-escalate. To flank. To box him in. Authority moved in formation, silent and coordinated, without a word being spoken. The crowd reacted instinctively. A woman gasped. Someone shouted, "He's not doing anything." Another voice called out a badge number, reading it aloud for the camera. The officer's jaw tightened. "Back up," he yelled at the crowd. "All of you. Back up now." They didn't move far. They didn't need to. The cameras were already close enough. The officer forced the man against the side of the patrol car, pressing his forearm into the man's upper back. Metal rattled. The hood vibrated slightly under the pressure. It was excessive. It was deliberate. "Hands behind your back," he repeated. The man complied slowly, deliberately, making no sudden movements. His wrists came together without struggle. Without resistance. Without fear. The officer yanked his arms higher anyway. The man winced, not from pain, but from the calculated humiliation of it. He said nothing. He let the moment speak for itself. "There," the officer said loudly, for the benefit of the cameras. "See how easy that is when you cooperate?" He snapped one cuff shut, then the other, tightening them more than necessary. The ratchet clicked twice too many times. The man's fingers curled slightly as the pressure bit into his wrists. "Too tight," the man said calmly. The officer ignored him. One of the bystanders spoke again. "Man, you don't gotta do all that." The officer turned his head sharply. "You're interfering with a lawful arrest." "For what?" the voice asked. The officer didn't answer. He didn't need to. Authority, in his mind, did not require explanation. It required compliance. He pushed the man's head down slightly, a gesture meant to diminish, not to protect. The cameras caught it clearly. The angle. The force. The intention. "Watch your head," he said, without moving his hand away. The man's cheek brushed the cold metal of the car. The blood stain smeared faintly, leaving a mark on the white paint. Red against white. Impossible to miss. That stain would matter later. The officer stepped back and looked at his work. A restrained man. A compliant subject. A crowd that had gone quiet again, uncertain, uneasy, watching. He turned to his colleagues. "Run him." One of them hesitated. "For what charge?" The officer's eyes snapped toward him. "Just for a second." "But it was enough." "Disorderly," he said. "Resisting." "Obstruction." The list came easily. It always did. The other officer nodded and moved toward the patrol car's computer. The system hummed to life, indifferent and efficient. The man lifted his head slightly. "You're creating charges to justify force," he said. The officer laughed, shaking his head. "You really like hearing yourself talk." "I like accountability," the man replied. That word again. The officer stepped closer, lowering his voice. You should have stayed quiet. I tried, the man said. You slapped me. The officer's face hardened. He leaned in close enough that only the man and the nearest cameras could hear him. You don't get to tell this story, he said. I do. He straightened and turned toward the crowd. This man became aggressive during a lawful stop, he announced. He refused commands and attempted to interfere with police operations. It was a performance. Polished. Confident. Familiar. Some people in the crowd shook their heads. Others whispered. Phones remained raised. The man said nothing now. He didn't argue. He didn't correct the record. He simply stood there, cuffed, pressed against a patrol car, letting the lies stack themselves neatly, one on top of the other, because false narratives were easier to dismantle when fully formed. The officer opened the back door of the patrol car. Get in. He guided the man forward, hand firm on his shoulder again, pushing him down toward the seat. The man ducked his head, careful, controlled. As he slid into the back seat, the officer leaned in once more. You should have known better, he said. The man looked up at him, eyes steady despite the cuffs, despite the crowd, despite the humiliation. I do know better, he replied. The door slammed shut, the sound echoed down the street, final and definitive. The officer stepped back, adjusting his uniform, already moving on mentally. Paperwork. Statements. A routine end to a routine stop. He didn't look at the cameras anymore. He didn't see the way the crowd lingered instead of dispersing. Didn't hear the quiet conversations beginning to form. Didn't notice the bloodstain on the hood of his car, still fresh, still visible, and he did not yet realize that by abusing his authority so openly, so confidently, he had documented every step of his own undoing. The patrol car door stayed closed for several seconds longer than necessary. Inside, the man sat upright, hands cuffed behind him, eyes forward. The plastic seat was cold against his back. The smell of disinfectant mixed with stale fabric filled the small space. Through the tinted window, shapes moved. Officers talking. Phones still raised. A crowd that had not gone away. The officer walked toward the driver's side, confidence restored by routine. He slid into the seat, shut the door, and reached for the radio. Dispatch, he said, voice steady, rehearsed. I've got one in custody. He paused, waiting for the familiar acknowledgement. It came. As he began reciting the fabricated charges, the man spoke from the back seat, not loud, not defiant, but clear enough to be recorded by the dash camera. For the record, he said, I am invoking my right to remain silent after this statement. The officer glanced at the rearview mirror, annoyed. You should have done that earlier. The man continued anyway. My name is Marcus Hale, he said. Employee identification number will be provided to your supervisor shortly. The officer frowned slightly. Not enough to show concern. Just enough to register the unfamiliar phrasing. Employee of what? He asked. There was a brief pause. Federal oversight, Marcus replied. The officer laughed. A short burst of sound, sharp and dismissive. Yeah. And I'm the Attorney General. Marcus did not react. I am assigned to an internal federal review task force, he continued calmly. My presence in this district is documented. Your actions during this stop are now part of an active federal record. The officer's smile lingered for half a second too long. Then it faltered. That's so, he said. You people always come up with something. Marcus leaned his head back against the seat, eyes still forward. You slapped me on camera, he said. You detained me without cause. You fabricated charges. You used excessive force after compliance. And you attempted to intimidate witnesses. Each sentence landed evenly. No emotion. No accusation. Just facts, lined up carefully. The officer turned in his seat now, looking back fully. You threatening me? No, Marcus said. I'm informing you. Outside the car, one of the other officers approached the window. Everything good? The officer hesitated before answering. Yeah. Fine. Marcus spoke again, louder this time, knowing the door was closed but the microphones were on. I am also notifying you, he said, that this stop has already been uploaded in real time. The officer's head snapped forward. What? Marcus met his eyes in the mirror. Body cams. Bystander footage. Live streams. Multiple angles. The slap alone is circulating. Silence filled the car, the radio crackled softly. Forgotten, the officer stared at Marcus, searching for cracks. For bravado. For fear. He found none. You're bluffing, he said, but the words lacked conviction. Marcus shook his head once. I don't bluff. Outside, a woman knocked lightly on the rear window, holding her phone up, screen facing in. The officer turned just enough to see it. His own face stared back at him, frozen mid-slap, paused by a viewer. He looked away. One of the other officers opened the passenger door. Sarge wants an update, he said quietly. Crowd's not leaving. Someone's asking for a supervisor. The officer swallowed. Tell him it's handled. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. You should call one yourself, he said. Now. The officer clenched the steering wheel. You don't give me orders. I know, Marcus replied. That's the problem. The radio crackled again. This time, the dispatcher's tone had changed. Unit 12, she said. Supervisor en route. Also, we're receiving inquiries regarding a video. The officer's shoulders stiffened. What video? He asked. There was a pause. The one where you strike a detained individual. The officer exhaled sharply, jaw tightening. He turned the volume down and sat back, eyes fixed on the windshield. Marcus spoke one last time before going silent. Everything from this moment forward, he said, will determine how severe this becomes. The officer did not respond. Outside, a second patrol car pulled up. Then a third. The crowd grew instead of shrinking. The air felt heavier, charged with anticipation. The balance had shifted, not with a shout, not with a threat, with a name, with a title, with evidence already in motion. The officer finally understood that the man in his back seat was not trapped. He was the reason this stop would be reviewed at the highest level, and the authority he had relied on so casually was about to be turned against him. The supervisor arrived without sirens. That detail mattered later. He parked a short distance away and approached on foot, posture controlled, eyes already scanning the scene. The crowd. The phones. The cluster of officers standing a little too stiff, a little too quiet. He had been doing this job long enough to recognize when a situation had outgrown the original report. He stopped beside the patrol car and looked through the rear window. Marcus met his gaze calmly. What's going on? The supervisor asked. The arresting officer spoke first, too quickly. Subject became aggressive during a traffic-related inquiry. Refused commands. Resisted. The supervisor didn't respond immediately. He looked down at the hood of the patrol car. At the faint red smear against the white paint, then he looked at the officer. Why is there blood on your vehicle? The officer hesitated. He was non-compliant. Marcus spoke from the back seat. I was slapped before any commands were given. The supervisor turned his head slowly. Slapped? The officer stiffened. Sir, he's making claims, on camera, Marcus added. From multiple angles. Silence. The supervisor exhaled through his nose and gestured toward the back door. Open it. The officer didn't move. I said open it, the supervisor repeated, firmer now. The door opened. Marcus stepped out carefully, cuffs still on, posture straight despite the restraint. The crowd leaned in as one. Phones adjusted. Someone whispered, this is it. The supervisor studied Marcus's face. The mark on his cheek. The dried blood near his mouth. The absence of panic. What's your name? He asked. Marcus Hale. Marcus replied. Federal oversight. I can provide credentials. The officer scoffed. He already tried that. The supervisor raised a hand, cutting him off without looking. You'll speak when I ask. That was the first visible crack, Marcus continued. My credentials are encrypted and accessible through interagency verification. I've already notified my chain. The supervisor's expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. Take the cuffs off, he said. The officer stared at him. Sir, now. The officer removed the cuffs. The metal clicked open, louder than before. Marcus flexed his wrists slightly, then let his arms rest at his sides. The supervisor turned to the arresting officer. Step back. He did. The supervisor faced Marcus again. You're alleging assault. I'm stating it, Marcus said. And documenting it. The supervisor nodded slowly. I'm going to need everyone's body cam footage preserved immediately. One of the officers shifted. My cam, preserved, the supervisor repeated. All of it. A radio crackled. Another voice cut in. Sarge, Internal Affairs is on the line. The arresting officer's face drained of color. The supervisor took the radio, listened for several seconds, then handed it back without comment. He turned to Marcus. They're requesting a formal statement, he said. Marcus nodded. They'll receive one. Along with supplemental evidence from civilian recordings. The supervisor glanced at the crowd. Ma'am, he said to the woman who had been filming from the start, your footage may be needed. She nodded. I already backed it up. The officer swallowed hard. Within minutes, the street transformed. What had been a routine stop site became a controlled scene. Yellow tape appeared. Additional supervisors arrived. The original officer was asked, then told, to step aside. He stood near the curb now, hands on his hips, watching as the narrative he had constructed collapsed in real time. An unmarked vehicle arrived next. 2 men and a woman stepped out, all in plain clothes, all moving with quiet efficiency. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't need to. The supervisor approached them. Brief words were exchanged. Heads nodded. Eyes shifted toward Marcus. One of the men extended a hand. Mr. Hale. Marcus shook it. Thank you for coming. The arresting officer's mouth fell slightly open. The woman turned toward him. Officer, she said, tone neutral, we're going to need your badge and weapon. What? He said. On what grounds? Pending investigation, she replied. Now. He looked to the supervisor. The supervisor did not intervene. Slowly, reluctantly, the officer removed his badge and placed it in her hand. Then his weapon. Each movement felt heavier than the last. The crowd murmured. Phones zoomed in. The woman continued. You are being placed on administrative leave effective immediately. This is bullshit, the officer muttered. The man beside her spoke quietly. Your language is also being noted. The officer said nothing more. Marcus stood a few steps away, watching without satisfaction, without expression. Justice, to him, was not about humiliation. It was about alignment. An ambulance arrived next, called not for spectacle but protocol. A medic examined Marcus's cheek, documented the injury, photographed it under controlled lighting. Does it hurt? She asked. Yes, Marcus replied. But that's not the point. The medic nodded. She understood. As the scene wound down, the crowd slowly dispersed, energized but restrained. They had seen what they came for. Not revenge. Accountability. Later that night, the videos spread. Not one clip. Dozens. The slap, the shove, the cuffs, the blood on the hood. The moment the supervisor ordered the cuffs removed, the badge being handed over, each angle reinforced the same truth. By morning, the officer's name was trending. By noon, the department issued a statement. By evening, the mayor was asked questions he wasn't prepared to answer. An emergency press conference was scheduled. Carefully worded phrases were delivered. We take these matters seriously. A thorough investigation is underway. We are committed to transparency. But transparency had already arrived without permission. Marcus sat in a quiet office several miles away, reviewing reports. Screens showed timestamps, cross-referenced footage, officer histories. "This isn't his first complaint," one analyst said. Marcus nodded. "It rarely is." Another report appeared. Use of force incidents. Dismissed claims. Settlements. A pattern. Charges against Marcus were officially dropped before they were ever filed. The officer, meanwhile, was interviewed for hours. His statements contradicted the footage. His justifications unraveled under scrutiny. Internal affairs moved quickly. Federal review accelerated it. Within a week, the officer was formally charged with assault under color of law, falsifying records, and civil rights violations. His union released a statement that it didn't help. The department placed 2 other officers under review for failure to intervene. That part mattered too, Marcus testified calmly. Precisely. Without embellishment, the slap was no longer just a moment. It was a catalyst, and the consequences, once set in motion, did not stop at one badge. The department did not call it reform at first. They called it review. An internal memo went out 48 hours after the charges were filed, marked urgent, distributed quietly through command channels. It outlined procedural gaps, language failures, opportunities for improvement. The words were careful, sanitized, designed to sound proactive without admitting fault, but the footage had already done what memos could not. Within days, federal oversight expanded beyond the single incident. Marcus's team requested 5 years of stop data from the precinct. Use of force reports. Body camera activation logs. Civilian complaints that had been closed without findings. Patterns began to surface, undeniable when placed side by side. Stops escalated faster under certain officers, cameras activated late, or not at all, witness statements discounted when inconvenient. The slap was no longer an outlier. It was a representative sample. The chief was briefed behind closed doors. Then again with city attorneys present. Then again with federal counsel on the line. Each meeting lasted longer than the last. Each one narrowed the range of acceptable outcomes. A policy suspension followed. Officers were ordered to review updated engagement protocols before returning to patrol. Mandatory de-escalation refreshers were scheduled, not months out, but immediately. Supervisors were instructed, formally, in writing, that failure to intervene would be treated as a disciplinary offense, not a judgment call. That language mattered. A civilian oversight board, long proposed and long delayed, was fast-tracked through the city council. The vote was not unanimous, but it passed. Public comment filled the chamber. Some voices shook. Others spoke with calm exhaustion. They had been waiting for a moment like this. When denial was no longer plausible, the department announced an external audit, not internal, not symbolic, external. The union objected, loudly. Press releases followed. Interviews. Claims of morale damage. But the footage undercut every argument before it could gain traction. Every denial was paired, online, with the sound of skin meeting skin. Marcus remained largely invisible during this phase. No interviews. No statements beyond formal testimony. His role was not to lead the conversation, but to ensure it could not be buried. Behind the scenes, recommendations hardened into requirements. Early warning systems were revised to flag officers with repeated complaints, regardless of outcome. Body camera policies were rewritten to remove discretionary activation. Failure to record now triggered automatic review. Most quietly of all, the department altered how complaints were categorized. Language that once softened conduct, discourtesy, miscommunication, was replaced with clearer terms. Force was force. Threats were threats. Names changed. Accountability followed. Several supervisors retired earlier than planned, others were reassigned. One precinct commander resigned outright. The arresting officer's case moved steadily through the system. No delays. No quiet settlement. The charges held. The evidence was too clean. The record too complete. For the first time in years, community trust surveys showed a measurable shift. Small, but real. People did not suddenly believe the system was fair. But they believed, now, that it could be forced to respond. That distinction mattered. At a closed-door briefing weeks later, Marcus addressed a room of officials. His voice was calm. His words precise. This did not happen because of one bad decision, he said. It happened because unchecked authority was normalized. No one argued. The reforms were not framed as punishment. They were framed as correction. Realignment. A recalibration of power back toward the law itself, not the individuals tasked with enforcing it. Outside the building, life continued. Patrol cars still rolled. Officers still answered calls. But something subtle had changed. Cameras were activated sooner, commands were given slower, hands stayed visible longer, not because of fear, because of awareness. The system had been reminded that it was being watched, not by the public alone, but by its own rules, finally applied without exception, and that awareness, once restored, was difficult to unlearn. Months later, the intersection looked ordinary again. Cars passed without slowing. Pedestrians crossed without lifting their phones. The blood stain was long gone, scrubbed away by time, weather, and city crews. To anyone unfamiliar with what had happened, it was just another piece of pavement in a busy district, but the moment had not disappeared. It lived in training rooms where recruits now watched unedited footage instead of staged scenarios. It lived in policy language that no longer left space for interpretation. It lived in the hesitation that appeared, just briefly, before hands reached out in anger. Marcus returned once, quietly. He stood on the sidewalk across the street, unnoticed, watching an officer conduct a traffic stop with deliberate calm. Clear commands. Distance maintained. Camera activated before contact. No raised voice. No unnecessary touch. The stop ended without incident. Marcus turned and walked away. Justice, he knew, was not measured by applause or headlines. It was measured by what happened next time. And the time after that. The officer who slapped him would be sentenced later that year. Not harshly. Not symbolically. Appropriately. The record would follow him. The authority he abused would never be returned. There was no celebration. There didn't need to be, because the real outcome wasn't the fall of one man. It was the reminder that authority is conditional. That power, when detached from accountability, is temporary. And that systems only change when someone forces them to confront themselves. The cameras that day didn't create justice, they preserved truth, and truth, once documented, does not belong to the powerful. It belongs to everyone. If this story stayed with you, it's not because of the slap. It's because of what followed, because calm dignity outlasted arrogance, because rules were finally applied upward, because accountability didn't rush, it arrived steadily, and it stayed. Stories like this don't ask for outrage. They ask for attention. For memory. For refusal to look away when silence would be easier. The next time authority overreaches, somewhere, someone will remember this moment. They'll remember that power can be reversed without shouting. That justice doesn't need violence to be effective. That evidence, patience, and truth are enough. And when that happens, the system moves, slowly, imperfectly, but forward.